Thanks so much for having me. I believe I gave a talk with GraphQL Sydney back in 2020. So a lot's happened since then. It's been quite a time, but I'm back and better than ever, some people say. So we'll see how we go. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Lyndon. I'll do some work for Hasura. So Hasura is a kind of GraphQL instant API company. If you don't know much about it, I'll talk a little bit about it in the talk. So I don't really need to wax on too much about it now. Yeah, so I thought I'd try something a little bit different for this evening's talk. So usually I'm very much kind of like a code first, demo centric, geek out, kind of get into Vim kind of presenter. But I thought for this evening's one, I'll try and do a no code, no kind of like tech demo presentation to keep with the theme of my talk, which is how I learned to stop worrying and love low code. So yeah, if you don't know what low code is, the idea is that, as a developer, maybe you would write a Ruby program or a Python program or maybe like a Java program to do things. But there are some kind of products and services out there that maybe can do some of those things for you automatically. You can still write a little bit of code, but maybe you don't have to write as much code to accomplish the same thing. So that's very vague. But Hasura is one of those products in the GraphQL space, with the idea that if you have some databases, you can hook it up and start making GraphQL queries very quickly without having to write a whole bunch of source code. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about Hasura, a little bit about the talk. I really kind of was racking my brains what kind of style of talk I wanted to give. I had so many interesting ideas, and I think I settled on a chaotic, meme-centric rant. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. Try and keep the vibes good throughout the talk. So yeah, let's get going. So what is GraphQL? So I think pretty much everyone has a good idea for the technicalities of what GraphQL is if you're at the GraphQL meetup. But I want to talk a bit more abstractly. What is the promise of GraphQL? What do you hope to get out of GraphQL by using it? And I kind of feel like the promise is freedom, right? It's like you want to be feeling expressive, like especially on the front end or the app side when you're writing your GraphQL queries, you want to feel very expressive in terms of like expressing your intent for what the data is that you're going to get. And you also want to feel kind of like expressive from the back end as well, right? It's like, I just want to build kind of like very general APIs that are going to kind of like give access to my data. I don't want to get down in the nitty gritty details of like this or that, right? So it's kind of like meant to be very, very expressive, and it's meant to be very lightweight. It's meant to have a nice kind of like free syntax and things like that. So yeah, the kind of like the vibes I get from GraphQL, or at least the promise of the vibes, is like freedom, right? It's going to set you free. So that's yeah, and even set you free from like too much data, over querying and stuff like that as well. You just get what you need. You just get what you want. It's great, right? Everyone loves it. Like you sell that idea to someone and they're like, where do I sign up? This sounds like so good. So yeah, everyone's heard it. Everyone wants to believe it or does believe it. And it feels like when you spin up your first GraphQL API or graphical or something, like especially with an existing app like Gatsby or something like that, it feels like, yeah, I can almost like tactilely feel the power of GraphQL, right? So yeah, on the front end, you don't have to wait for backend devs anymore. That's another kind of great thing. It's like, because the API is so general and it's just kind of describes relationships, you can just kind of like get what you want when you want it. You don't have to ask people to do something for you. You don't have to be like, hey, friend over on the backend API team, can you spin up another resource kind of route for me that joins users to dogs or whatever, and then give that to me? Instead, you just traverse the graph and you get what you want. So that's great from the front end. From the back end, yeah, you don't really need to worry about rejigging things. You just kind of like establish the relationships. And then from the business side as well, like that makes the big promises there. It's like, it's going to be faster, right? Because no one's waiting for people anymore. And everyone can just get what they want when they want it. And there's another kind of like business promise, which is sometimes mentioned, which is that, well, you'll now be able to provide an API to like devs who want to use your stuff for free because you've got a GraphQL API that your browser's using. It's high quality. Just kind of like make it public, maybe. Free API, pretty sweet. And so, yeah, this lets you escape from the planet of rest, which is a horrible place to be sometimes. And so, yeah, that'll let you have a consistent API. This I heard that is meant to be like overhearing the rumor. Yeah, I heard that GraphQL lets you finally have a consistent API. I heard that it lets you stop worrying about the details. I heard that it lets you share types. And I heard that it's so beautiful and so elegant and so expressive. And you look online and you look at places like this meetup and all the kind of big companies using this stuff, and everyone is having the world's best time. Like it's clear as day, right? You see, it's revolutionizing web development. It's revolutionizing maybe iPhone development. It's revolutionizing everything. It's revolutionizing data. It's revolutionizing UIs. It's just like so amazing. And everyone's telling these amazing success stories. You know, it's like, you know, we're building super graphs and we're redesigning the way that development occurs, and we've cut down our delivery time from months to mere seconds. It's so great. So is that it? Clearly not, right? So yeah, I wanted to kind of like frame that first part of the talk as the promise, right? So that's the promise of GraphQL. And I think everyone here is probably very familiar with that because we're all super hype about this amazing technology. But there are some issues, right? When you actually kind of like dig your fingers into this stuff, especially as like an API developer, there are some broken promises, I'll call them, right? So yeah, the feeling I got when it's like I'm writing these APIs and I felt some of these bad vibes, I was like, if there's nothing wrong with what I'm doing, then why does this feel so bad? Yeah, so another way of putting it is freedom isn't free, right? It costs $1 or $3, I think is the line. So yeah, there's some issues come up when you start kind of like building APIs and interacting with them. So like, here's some things I've thought personally and heard other people kind of say. It's like, yeah, so maintaining this consistency that's been promised is kind of hard. Why do I end up with so much code, really, when everything is kind of like doing the same thing? Why do I still have, you know, files and files full of Ruby or whatever language that I'm writing my APIs in? And I can never really kind of like decide how much logic to put in my resolvers. Like, what do I want these things to do? Like they're so powerful, but where do I draw the line on what I want to leverage from that power? And then, yeah, it's like we still didn't ditch our REST server. It's like, yeah, our company adopted GraphQL, but now we've just got 2 servers, and it's like terrible. And now we need a facade server, and we've got anyway. I trail off on that one. Cause, I think, is the punchline. And then yeah, and then finally, imagine you got your ship in order and everything is super great. Well, performance might still be really problematic, right? You could have everything so beautiful and so elegant, but if it takes 10 seconds to fetch the user's dogs, then no one is going to use your pet store, right? Yeah, so yeah, that was kind of my feeling writing some of these things, as I ended up with so much code. That was a bit of a broken promise to me. I thought it was going to be so little code. I still needed to end up writing a lot of code. Also errors. So I think you kind of get the idea that everything is like so disciplined in terms of how it's set up. Like you don't get any real errors anymore. You don't have any like issues, logic problems, all that kind of stuff. They're all meant to go away. In reality, I think like you'll find they don't go away. They're still there. Yeah, and in general, like why are things complicated when they're meant to be simple, right? Is what I would kind of like call a broken promise of GraphQL. Yeah, and so for those of you in the audience that are front-end developers, the big gotcha is, or the big broken promise is like, this was meant to be self-service. This was meant to stop me waiting on API devs. So why is it that I still need to message, you know, Joe Blogg's API dev over on the API team to build me something? Shouldn't GraphQL solve this problem for me? It seems like there should be a relationship there. Why can't I just look it up? Instead, they have to go write some code, and it takes a week because they're busy or whatever. This sucks, man. It's terrible. Yeah, and so then the worst problem of all, right, is that you feel like it's your fault, right? Because you see all these success stories of how wonderful everyone at time is having, and you say, am I just a bad engineer? Am I just a bad person? Like, this is, I feel like maybe if I was better at my job, then I wouldn't have any of these problems, right? So I'm here to say that, no, you are an amazing engineer. You're a great engineer. These problems are everywhere. You just don't see people talking about them because no one wants to kind of like talk about the issues that they've had, really, unless they've got a really exciting issue. Like, you know, we managed to store 1,000 petabytes of dog photos in our database. Like, that's a cool issue. But like, we effed up our resolver 8 times is not a cool issue. So no one's going to talk about that, right? So I'm here to say you're an amazing engineer, and it's selection bias that's making you think your problems come from you, right? So yeah, what's to be done about all of this, I guess, is the question, right? So I think, you know, there's a kind of like a few solutions out there for this kind of stuff. Better kind of abstractions and better frameworks and you know, like patterns that you can adopt and things like that. And for sure, like I'm not kind of like trying to say that those aren't worthwhile or worth using, but there's another option besides them, which I call the promised land of low code. And that's a picture of from the Land Before Time, I think, with you know, Littlefoot and the star leaves and all of that. So you know it's got to be real good if I'm using that picture. So yeah, so obviously I've mentioned before. So I work at this company called Hasura, which builds a kind of low-code GraphQL tool. So if you want, you can take away from this talk me trying to sell you something, although I don't get any commission, so it's not really not really that useful for me directly. But I think more useful for you guys is to take away this idea of low code is like a very viable thing to do, and there are other competitors out there and different kind of like low code paradigms you can use too. So don't think you need to use Hasura as the takeaway. It's that be open, like open your mind and explore the possibilities of low code, I think, is what I want to kind of like impart from this presentation, right? Yeah, so what I was also thinking when I wrote this slide is when you look at that word you too many times, I'm like, is that how you spell you? I feel like it's not, but it is. Yeah, so here's Hasura, right? So you knew it was going to come. You may have heard about it before, you may not have. Hopefully you haven't, because the less people that have heard about it, the better my job talking about it is being in effectiveness. So there you go. Yeah, so you might have even tried it, but maybe you're skeptical, right? Or even annoyed. You've heard of it and you don't like it, right? So that's kind of like, this is where the kind of meat of my talk comes in, is I've actually made this journey myself. And I call this this kind of annoyance when you hear the word low code or you hear the word Hasura, as the fear of losing control. I didn't coin this term, my colleague Praveen coined it, but I think it's great. It perfectly sums up this problem, right? It's like, especially if you're one of these API devs, but probably also if you're in the business side of things or even the front end side of things. When you hear kind of low code, you think, I'm kind of like handing over my superpowers from my code, which I write myself, that can do anything, to this tool that's very kind of prescriptive and wants to control how things work, right? Yeah, so what might people say? What might their objections be? The first one I think is about everything is special, right? My app is super special and it's very specialized, and I'm super special and I write special code, right? I need extremely sophisticated logic in my app. I can't even explain to you how sophisticated it is unless you've got a PhD in logic, right? That's what it's like. That's how sophisticated it is. And I'm a 10x developer. Didn't you hear? It's on my LinkedIn. So, I want to use that power. I don't want to like give it up to some Duplo kind of like baby's toy, right? I might be worried about that, losing my powers. Then the second one is probably the more practical and more common if people are very familiar with this stuff. Objection is, I can't just kind of like make my database do everything and just put everything in my database. So yeah, if you've heard of these kind of like low-code approaches, that is probably the like most showstoppery objection that you can think of. You're like, yeah, it's great, but as soon as I need to do something which the database doesn't do, then forget it. It's a non-starter. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty valid objection in some kind of aspect, but we'll dive into that. And yeah, like a similar vein to that is like, yeah, where does my business logic go, right? Like not cockroach DB, can't go in there. So where does it go then? Good questions. Yeah, so I used to feel that way too. So I actually built some GraphQL APIs that did pretty interesting things in the machine learning space in a previous life. So I was like, yeah, these are pretty special, right? And like they got a lot of business logic and they're kind of very domain specific. It's like, how could some low-code tool, fit this use case? Surely not. Okay. So yeah, let's kind of like dive into it. So I guess, yeah, my response to these kind of like objections, and please bear with me, this is all very like heavily straw man kind of like approach to this rant. So don't take anything personally. It's more just meant to kind of like hype the crowd up rather than necessarily be a totally accurate representation of this this straw man kind of like person that I'm having this dialogue with. But yeah, so my kind of response to these, number one, you are an excellent engineer, right? I think I've already said this, right? But you're wasting your life skinning databases, right? It's like, how many times as an API developer have you kind of like dived into an app and without even thinking, you start writing REST endpoints, or you start writing, GraphQL fields and edges and resolvers and things. You don't even have to begin kind of like questioning it. It's obvious you've got to do that. You do the scaffold, you kind of pull up your model, you start writing it's like brain off, fingers on, right? You start writing it. Yeah, so I'm like shocked and appalled at how much time engineers spend doing this thing over and over and over. And even if they write frameworks and stuff like that, it still takes up so much time. I think in a best case scenario, it's like less than 50% time, but it often ends up being up to or more in some cases than 50% of the time of building apps, which is crazy. So I like to not just say that that's bad, but it's an opportunity cost. When you're building routes and you're building resolvers and defining relationships and stuff, you're not doing something else. What might be something more valuable than that? That's a good question to ponder. Yeah, another kind of like thought I've heard people express is like, you think low code can replace me? But then I hear an echo of a doubt in their mind. What if it can replace me? That would be awful. I'd lose my job. Yeah, don't worry about that. Relax, right? It's like, hopefully it will replace the boilerplate kind of like grunt work that you're doing, but that makes you more valuable because then the money that you're paid over the time that you spend is going to be allocated to more useful things, right? So actually, like as an engineer, provided the app can't be like completely described by like a database set of database tables, which is, 99% of useful apps do something more than that, then you're going to have some useful work to do still, but you'll be like vastly more productive at doing it, right? Yeah. So moving on. Yeah, stop skinning databases. So ever since I heard this term skinning a database, I've just like never got it out of my mind. It's such a beautiful way of saying it. It's like, yeah, what are devs kind of doing all the time? Oh yeah, they're database skinning, right? It's like, okay, like I think there is value in it. Don't let me diminish like beautiful user interfaces for sure. But certainly like the majority of that kind of like graphic design presentation work should occur on the front end, not in the API. Right, yeah. The other objection, complicated logic exists, right? Yes, it does. We cannot ignore complicated logic, especially if I'm purporting that you'll be more valuable because you'll be working on maybe complicated logic instead of routing, right? Well, it certainly does exist, and I've even seen it once or twice, but it doesn't exist everywhere, and it's often slow. So we'll come back to that slow thing in a bit. But yeah, so like imagine this scenario, right? It's like you take your favorite stack and the complicated logic that you need to write, you write it there, right? And you invoke very dangerous and amazing routines in your stack, like launch the satellite or like buy whatever people buy, stocks or something online for real money, right? So things that you definitely want to think about and take great care that you've done it right, and maybe the mechanics are very complicated. All right, great. So once you've done that, yeah, you need some routes or whatever for those things for sure. So once you've done that, okay, great, good job. You've done some valuable work. So don't spend the same amount of effort that you've spent doing that kind of thing, right? Like curating how users are laterally joined to widgets and then like regex replacing PhD out of their name or whatever, right? Like that kind of thing is not a valuable use of your time, I guess is what I'm going to say. It can still be done somewhere, right? But yeah, foreign keys exist. Let's leverage them, right? And yeah, the JavaScript front end code or like your app code like exists, right? To choose how you display things. Leverage that, right? Because you're already going to be taking great care on how that works and how that's written. So you might as well kind of use that as the location to do that kind of stuff. Yeah, then the other kind of point I'd like to make is that the world, or at least the internet, in some ways is async. It's more async than ever, right? So let's stop pretending that it is synchronous. So what's this point all about? So when you're kind of like splicing in your very cool logic into like a synchronous, resolver or even like a traditional REST endpoint or something like that, right? Yeah, it's cool that you can do it there for sure. But actually kind of like a very common side effect is that everything's slowing down. And this actually gets the effect of how bad this is gets dramatically multiplied in something like GraphQL, where you can kind of have a combinatorial explosion of like how many things are being traversed. That can get real gnarly, especially like if it's along a critical path. Any slowness along there, yeah, gets multiplied, right? Well, added, I guess. but yeah, the effect on the users is very bad, right? It's like if they go to use your e-commerce app and it's like takes ages to hit a third-party API and pull something down and do something with it and join it with hit another API and join it and pull it back and all this stuff. They've gone to another store and bought their dog bed instead of your dog bed store, which I'm sure is better than their store, but they can't use it because it's too slow. Correct? Yeah. So what can I say about this? Right? It's like, well, let's accept it. Let's accept async is kind of like very integral to like how things work these days, and take this approach. Right? It's like async processes can run like in the background or run by a third party or with kind of like Lambda style services or something like that. And they can then do what they're doing, finish their job, populate the actual kind of like important data back into a table. That's like a tale as old as time. It's not terribly controversial. But I think people forget about that because they're so enamored with the power of the resolvers and what they can do in them sometimes that they forget that not only just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something, right? So then a more kind of modern pattern, right, with WebSockets and things like that is you can actually subscribe to these collections that are going to be populated later. And you can get the real-time app experience that everyone loves, but so few people have the time to build, right? It's so shiny. And so everyone's going to love that. Yeah, so not only does that work very well, actually, that has another nice implication about this business logic stuff, that's right. So if that's kind of nicely decoupled, not just in a modular way, but in a service way from your application and your API, gives you more freedom for how you can implement it. How am I going for time here? 25. I got a few more minutes. All right, so yeah, then yeah, the other big objection, I guess, was this database thing. It's like, well, I can't have anything that depends too strongly on the structure of my database, right? Because do you know what I like to do? It's like every Friday, actually, I throw a dart on the board to determine what part of my schema I'm going to dramatically change to be totally different. And then I do that. and then on Monday, I rewrite my API kind of logic so that it presents the same API, but it does something totally different under the hood to use my new schema. Said nobody ever. It's like the craziest thing. Yet everyone brings this up as a huge objection to low-code stuff. They're like, I can't even dream of adopting anything that is even transcendentally linked to the structure of the database, because I would change my database every day and my API needs to stay exactly the same. Well, yeah, I mean, I won't deny probably there are scenarios where that's true. But it happens, I think, much, much less than anyone could ever possibly, claim it happens, right? So I think, yeah, you kind of hear these two things. What if I change everything about my database, and how will I keep my API the same? So my response to that is like, let's get real. Come on, like get serious. That is not happening. If it is happening, there are some fundamentally weird things going on at your company. And why are you doing that? But yeah, even if it is happening, most times it'll be simple. And most kind of low-code solutions will allow you to provide a stable interface against simple changes, like renaming things and stuff like that, right? Huge changes, yes, the low code is going to have an impedance mismatch, but I would suggest that when you do a huge code change, like a huge database schema change in the most flexible environment ever, it's usually because you want to have an API change as well. So I would say like most of the time, that's just like, it doesn't introduce any new big problems because you're using low code in a scenario like that. All right, rant over. So hopefully I haven't scared everyone off. So vibe check, bad vibes. That rant is like so negative. I'm very sorry about that. I think I had love hearts on the first slide. So yeah, this is not going well. I've really kind of like put a downer on the party. So let's take a breath. Relax. So this is kind of where my talk is wrapping up, so to speak. So there's kind of like two links I'd like you to check out if you are interested in what I've said. So first is like this 3-factor architecture. So a lot of the patterns I've talked about or kind of like alluded to are summed up more eloquently in this this Hasura 3-factor app architecture. So if you're familiar with the old Heroku 12-factor app, this is our take on the 12-factor app. It's meant to be a rethinking of that for the modern web. And then also we've implemented a lot of these patterns in the Hasura Super app, which is just an example app, which is kind of like an e-commerce store. So you can check that out and yeah, see if you like it. It's meant to use like most of the Hasura features. But once again, this isn't a Hasura sales pitch. It's meant to kind of like be be a kind of like setting you at ease and thinking, don't stress too much about low code. Actually have a think about leveraging it. So yeah, that's my talk. Hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, if you want to get in touch, I've got an email, LinkedIn, and GitHub. Probably LinkedIn is probably the best. I don't have a lot of other social media. I don't have any Twitter or anything. So that's probably the best if that's all right with you. Otherwise, do email me. That's okay too. And yeah, that's, Hasura prompted me to give a talk because I haven't given one in a while. So thanks to them. And yeah, there's some links. And then I wanted to use lots of Dr. Strangelove memes because of the title reference, and I totally failed at that. So I've included them here at the end. So yeah, that's my talk. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Cool. Thanks very much, Lyndon. I might take some questions from the in-person audience first. Has anyone got anything they want to ask, Lyndon?
Your slides were great.
Slides are great. Comment.
Thank you. No questions.
All right.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
How about online?
Yeah, sure.
Part of Google. Yep, go on, Rob.
Lynn, do you that was a fantastic talk. I really like that, and I am a back-end engineer at heart, but I get it. I get you very much. Are you familiar enough with Superbase to kind of compare and contrast Hasura and Superbase?
Yeah, no, unfortunately not. I can't say I've really used it much. Yeah, I should use more of the competitors more often. I think that would be like very diligent of me, but yeah, I've kind of got my head down a bit and haven't really had the chance to do that, unfortunately. But yeah, what are your thoughts? Have you used it?
Yes, I have. So I've dabbled in both Hasura and Superbase. I guess Superbase is much more of a like at the core, they're a Postgres as a service with a whole bunch of things, including now GraphQL, which they didn't have from the beginning. Whereas Hasura, I believe, you've always been GraphQL, but they now do have that along with WebSockets and REST. Yeah, the thing that interests me with these kinds of solutions, which I probably can ask you about Hasura, is two things: authentication and also like doing kicking off sort of like that complex logic. So you hit an endpoint that's managed by Hasura. How do you
for sure
do the background processing?
Yeah. So I guess like presently, like Hasura's trying to kind of like expand its perception from being more than just a Postgres kind of like API to kind of like a more full kind of like data layer solution. So like personally, the team I'm on is building support for tons of different databases at the moment, right? But that aside, that kind of like perception thing aside, yeah. So how do you do these complex business logic? So there's kind of like two main recommended approaches, right? Well, I guess there's three, but the first one's kind of like a little bit of a cop out. But yeah, the first kind of one is, well, if you can do it as like a view or a function in your database, that's probably the best. Because like we recommend, like if you can put it in your database and express it with database patterns, that's probably the best way, because like the database is very good at that stuff. But that being said, yeah, it's a cop out, right? Because like there's a lot of things you can't do that way. So the two big recommendations are one like kind of like synchronous and one asynchronous. So the synchronous way is via what we call actions. So basically, like you can use a webhook that's exposed via GraphQL, and then its results kind of like marshal back into fields and things that you can query and join on, right? And you can basically do anything in that. So you can use that. As to your question for authentication, you can do authentication with that if you want, or you can do anything that a webhook can handle. If you want to use like AWS Lambda through a gateway, you could do that, or you can, if you've got a traditional stack that you really love, if you want to use your enterprise Java beans on Tomcat, go for it, right? Yeah, the second way is like the async way, which is kind of like done through events and triggers and things like that. So Hasura has a couple of mechanisms of how you can do that. But once again, it's kind of like a webhook trigger, but these are not done synchronously. So they're kind of like, you can kind of like either just kind of like export basically an entire log style table of serialized event requests for whatever you want to happen. And then that can go off via webhook to a service, or even directly via the database to a service if you want. Process it, put the results back. And if you want to kind of like have it feel seamless, you can use that subscription pattern that I alluded to earlier, where you have a GraphQL subscription to the kind of place where the data should end up. And that kind of like ID, correlation ID can be automatically kind of like set up for you as well. Does that kind of answer the question?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, so that seems to be a little bit more, I guess, more of a well-developed, I guess, solution than maybe the last time I played with Hasura. So yeah, that sounds good.
Oh yeah, with regards to the authentication, yeah, we're pretty much like totally coupled to JWTs at the moment. So yeah, that's you could see that as a limitation, like that we don't do some other kind of advanced patterns, but JWTs are pretty dang pervasive now. So you can probably get one, and then Hasura can work with them.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, thanks very much.
No worries.
Does anyone else online have a question? All right. Seems like we're out of questions. So thanks very much, Lyndon. That was great. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, sorry. No, we do have one more question.
Sorry. Yeah, I do. Thanks, Lyndon, and thanks, Paul, for that. I have a quick question. Sorry, it seems like there's an issue with my video. I'd rather not to bother you guys. Thanks, Lyndon, for the talk. I have a quick question about the event-based architecture, because I had a look at the three-factor just now, and I realized that it's just advocating that idea of having event-based architecture. But as you were saying, sometimes we've got legacy applications, or having event-based is not that easy to go that way.
For sure.
So yeah, so I'm wondering, what is your suggestions to not having those kind of coupling with the database, but instead using the power of Hasura in this case?
So let me rephrase your question, and you can tell me if I got it wrong. So there's a lot of traditional applications which don't fit nicely into an event architecture. What does Hasura recommend that people do in that situation? Is that your question?
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I figure, yeah, probably the easiest and nicest and most kind of like straightforward thing to do is use the actions, right? So that everything is synchronous when you use an action. And basically what the interface presented to a like front-end dev or someone using the GraphQL API is it's just going to look like a mutation. You can do query ones as well, but 99% of the time you'll want one that does something, right? So it'll be a mutation, and then it will then kind of like be able to send a payload and potentially transform it with a new feature to a web service. That web service will do whatever it wants to do with it in the traditional way, send it back. Then we have a kind of field definition that should match the response, and then map that into fields that can then be joined on as well using kind of relationships, and then sent back as a mutation response. So yeah, if your pattern fits that, it's real nice, real easy, and yeah, like totally fits with the traditional kind of style architecture as well.
Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Paul. That was